A very good morning, John. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever our viewers are.
Good morning to you.
Yeah, good to have you back on Parliamentary Pondering.
Well, it's good to have you on the programme.
And we're sitting here, and the weather is completely
a pleasurable time.
Yes, and the weather is completely British, isn't it?
Very British. It's supposed to be a heat wave this week, and there have been many sunny days, but at the moment it doesn't look very auspicious, it has to be said. It's a very
We'll be
cloudy
completely
sky.
fine. Pakistanis love this kind of weather. I'm quite happy. Anyway, so yeah, we're here to discuss leadership and the kind of leadership there is out there, and especially at this point in time when the world is like full of these massive challenges like pandemic, like inequalities increasing, and migrations, and of course recession, inflation, all over the place. In the middle of that, we deserve good leadership, because good leadership will get us through our challenges. But really, in 2022, the question today that I'd like to discuss with you: what kind of leadership is there in North, South, wherever? It's all over. The basic question: should leaders be born out of Parliament? Or what do you think?
In my view, the parliamentary system is preferable. I think that a presidential system certainly wouldn't work in the UK. Our system has become more presidential in that prime ministers, because of television, have communicated more and more and more directly with the public, and they often think that they've got a direct line to the voters, and they imagine that they are the chosen leader. But actually, in our system, people elect a parliament from which a government is drawn. Now, are we well governed? I personally think at the moment the UK is very badly governed, but I don't think it's peculiar to us. There are presidential systems where government isn't strong, or where there is huge division. So, for example, if you take the United States, I think that President Biden has good values and sound instincts, but there are lots of competing sources of power in America, and he can't control everything. I think if he had his way, he'd probably like to tackle gun crime, but guns are rife in the United States, and that's very difficult to challenge and to change overnight. And in the UK, I suppose I feel the most important point is that the government has to be accountable.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we agree on that. There needs to be accountability to Parliament. I'm going to put you on the hot seat. And the hot seat today is a tour du monde. It's going to be like a world tour. And just one phrase. Every time I come up with the name of a leader, just one phrase, please. Biden, Bibi in Israel, and Trump in US. What do you think?
Bibi, narrow-minded.
Yes.
Unable to reach across the pond, if I can put it that way. He can't reach across the divide. He is a tribal leader.
One phrase, John.
Sorry, okay. Okay, all right, one phrase. Okay, let's start again. One phrase. Bibi.
Yes.
Narrow and tribal.
Yes. Trump.
Mad, bad, and dangerous to know.
Okay, I'm not going to say anything. Raisi in Iran.
Poisonous.
Why'd you say that?
And egregious.
Okay, no, one phrase. We're going to stick to this. Bolsonaro in Brazil.
I haven't made a study of.
Okay, fair enough. Erdogan in Turkey.
A dangerous fanatic.
Interesting. Boris in UK, you have plenty to say. It's going to be tough to contain you at one phrase. Just
Utterly
one phrase.
deluded.
Thank you, one phrase. Marcos in Philippines, the junior Marcos. Dynastic?
Yeah, sense of entitlement.
Okay. Myanmar, let's go to Putin. And that's a very hot subject right now.
A tyrant.
How about...
Well, I would say, let me put it bluntly.
Okay.
An evil tyrant.
Okay.
Who cares nothing for human life.
Okay, and so that's basically that. The reason I put these kind of
names... What's your take?
Yeah, my take is as follows now. My take is that, when I put these kind of names forward, a kind of picture, a pattern develops. And the pattern I'm looking at is political, is authoritarian. Okay? Some of them are military background, some. Most try to be populist, but in the process can be larger than what they should be. It's the other phobia that they're trying to sell, not all of them. So I'm being careful that, it's a type of leadership that's trying to create us versus them. So it's more divisionary. And from my point of view, from my political ethos, it needs to be more inclusive. and also past empire glorification. Have you noticed how they're all trying to hang on to or trying to project a past empire and glorify that, to project their present?
Yes.
God, family, fatherland
Yes.
versus the state liberalism, you know, and ethnic majoritarianism versus cosmopolitanism versus multilateralism, perhaps force versus election,
Yeah.
like you see with Putin, and
Well,
force
Putin,
versus,
but also actually and horrifyingly in the United States in recent times
Yeah.
with Trump. In other words, you expect
Yeah.
a phenomenon of might is right.
Might is right.
In Russia,
Versus negotiations.
you don't really expect that in the United States, which after all is a great democracy.
and so
But
negotiations are falling. Are they becoming not so fashionable? Is it more fashionable to go and use force everywhere? I mean, is this history repeating itself as well? I mean, this is not the first time.
I think it is becoming fashionable
Yeah.
for a so-called strong man to appear, and at least for a time to beguile people into the idea, Marvi, that there are simple solutions. And what you just need is a willful, dominant,
Yeah.
high-powered individual calling the shots. Actually, it doesn't work. I think it's quite interesting that Trump, frankly, rather admired Putin. Why? Because he saw bits of Putin in himself. But the difference is that Putin is in a country which is not accustomed to democracy. Trump is in a country that is accustomed to democracy. And he just couldn't abide or accept being turfed out. He was turfed out by the voters, but as you know, he railed literally violently against his removal from office in a way that I haven't observed in the United States in my
So
lifetime.
what you're saying is that what we're saying is that if there's chaos and there's disorder versus order, can we hear the order?
Order.
Thank you very much. That works so much. So if we're seeing disorder versus order and we're seeing chaos, we are naturally going to have a resurgence of an emergence of the strong leadership. Versus, I want to come back to perhaps UK and other countries, versus political parties being strong. So it's a question of, that leadership, that individual reigns supreme versus the political party. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think it's very important that parties are just that. Groups of people acting together in pursuit of some common principle or purpose. A party shouldn't be a one-person show. So if you take the UK context, for example, at the moment we have a Conservative government. It is up to the Conservative Party to decide who its leader should be. And for there to be a government which includes a cabinet and has a collective responsibility system, it shouldn't be about worshipping at the altar of one individual. And yet I feel that in recent times the tendency of the leader of the Conservative Party, the Prime Minister, has been to behave as though the power is his.
In recent times?
I would say literally over the last 3 years, and in
But in
recent
the past?
days I think
Okay,
it's become
more so
apparent.
now, we agree. But even in the past, you've had this system of political parties being overshadowed by the leader. Come on, you've had very strong prime ministers.
Yes, political parties have been overshadowed by the leader because that leader has been a strong personality. But I think there's been one key difference, and that is that Margaret Thatcher, John
Yes.
Major,
Yeah.
Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May, all accepted that in the end they depended upon their parties and on the support of Parliament. Boris Johnson
You're convinced
behaves-
about that?
Yes, I think that's the evidence. I mean, for example, Mrs. Thatcher was an incredibly strong and some people would say domineering individual, but once she lost the support of her cabinet and her party, she resigned.
Yeah.
She just accepted, well, I can't carry on if they don't support me.
Yeah,
John
true.
Major lost an election and resigned. Tony Blair didn't lose an election.
So they know
but
how
his
to
party
resign.
decided to say goodbye to him.
They know
And he
how to
accepted
resign.
that. They know how to resign. David Cameron resigned because he lost the referendum on Brexit.
Not all of them know
And
how to resign, John.
I'm afraid Boris Johnson doesn't know the meaning of the word.
Yeah.
defeat.
By the time this goes on air, maybe he would have resigned.
He might have done, and I think it would be very much more dignified if he did. But at the moment, he's behaving as though he's got some sort of divine right to continue in office. He doesn't have that, and I'm afraid he's in for a rude awakening before very long.
Yeah. So coming to pandemic leadership, when I say pandemic leadership, what comes to your mind immediately?
leadership by example,
Yeah.
I think I would say. And there have been some very good examples.
Let's hear them.
Well, I think that Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand has been a very good example of somebody who's led with a fixity of purpose, and she's been an exemplar of good practice and proper conduct, and that has filtered through her political party, her government, her parliamentary colleagues, and the country. And the record has been very good.
Merkel?
Well, I think Angela Merkel.
Women at that point were being flagged as women leaders. They've done really well in in the pandemic. So these two names came up. Do you agree? Women perform better in the pandemic?
They've often got better emotional intelligence.
Oh, so you do accept that?
I do accept that. Yes, I do accept that, and I think that Angela Merkel isn't necessarily the most strikingly charismatic figure. But she has been a very authoritative figure.
And you needed that.
Authoritative not by banging the table and insisting on her point of view, but by force of example and by accumulated experience. And she's been a great success. I think the problem in Britain has been that our performance during the pandemic has been very mixed. There's been some good things. The rolling out of the vaccine has been a great success, but there were some bad things. A terrible shortage of personal protective equipment, too late to lock down, too quick to come out of lockdown, huge numbers of deaths. It's been, to be honest, a grotesque mistake. But I think the worst feature of the British system has been that there has been a double standard. And that is what I think.
So in leadership, there should be no double standard.
Well,
so we're talking about leadership.
Well, I think if you're going to say to people you can't socialise,
then you do it yourself.
And then you do it yourself, and it comes out that actually the Prime Minister and his colleagues have been staging booze-ups in number 10 Downing Street. That really offends people's sense of what is right. After all, if you think about it, in societies across the world, people are motivated by what affects them. Issues of the pocket and issues of, if you like, home and hearth. And if people see that while they're making sacrifices, not going to funerals, not seeing their relatives before they die, but actually their relatives are doing differently, they think, wow, so it's one rule for us and another for them.
That's
and
the
that
same
is
everywhere.
just unacceptable.
Yeah, and that reflects on the electorate as well. I mean, people get voted out.
Yes, they do, although, of course, elections in most reasonably stable democracies, and Britain's system is flawed, but it is a stable democracy, come only every 4 or 5 years. So we're not actually due to have a general election in Britain for another nearly 2.5 years. So will people's patience wear thin? I think people's patience will wear thin, and indeed is wearing thin.
Yeah, coming to a pandemic, I was reading somewhere, and it really struck me that, whilst we were talking about the women prime ministers taking front seat on the pandemic side, it was actually Norway which really performed really well. And the reason they performed well, and the reason I want to mention this today in Parliamentary Ponderings, is because they were simply the kind of leadership that they had. They were eager to learn from their mistakes. So they had a commission even after they had performed well to learn from their mistakes, and also despite their success, and that they were transparent. And they accepted, a leadership that accepts, John, you've been in Parliament leading parliamentarians, a leadership that accepts that, we don't have all the answers, we don't know right now, and that we could get it wrong, and that we should have the flexibility to say, hey, I don't want to call it a U-turn, because in Pakistan U-turn has a different connotation, but if things are not working out, they have the flexibility to say, hey, it did not work, we need to fix it, and this is how we. So Norway is being flagged as one of those where they were upfront about their issues, that perhaps they didn't have all the answers, and that's how they were successful. Is what the study is saying.
Well, that's
they were honest about uncertainty. So should leadership? The question to you is: should leadership be honest about uncertainty and the unexpected, and reserving the right to change if not right at that point?
Yes, I think leadership should include the opportunity for review. That is to say, to revisit things, and not at some point in the distant future, thus far unspecified, but as one goes along, it should be possible to review. I think the difficulty that we've got, we haven't found a way of tackling this or a solution to it, is that, yes, the government here would say, in the United Kingdom, of course we must have a review. but they will tend to determine the timetable for that review. So has there yet been a public inquiry into the conduct of the government over the pandemic? There hasn't, and they won't want it to come until they're ready for it.
So that's a different
And that, I think, is
characteristic
a
of a nation, isn't it? I mean, the Norwegians on one end, us on the other end, you on the other end. So that does, leaders are born out of the people elect. So you get the leadership that you are or that you deserve. How would you feel about that?
Well, ultimately, people have to decide whether they think they're well served or not, and whether they're well governed or not. And if they don't think they're well governed, if they think that the leadership is poor, there isn't a perfect solution, but they have to choose between competing alternatives. And if they decide, to put it bluntly, that the present crowd or shower are making a mess of matters, well, then they have to elect an alternative.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, in a democracy, of course, responsibility, ultimate responsibility, rests with the people, and Democrats in all political parties have to accept that. But you don't have elections every year or every other year. You have elections typically every 4 or 5 years. There are countries, for example, Israel, where elections are somewhat more frequent than that.
Especially recently.
And in Italy, historically, there will be very regular elections and so on. But in the UK, it's every 4 or 5 years. And so people will have their chance to deliver their verdict. But in the meantime, I suppose what I'm saying is that it would be good if we could import something from the world of business models.
Yes,
in
I was coming to that.
Companies will constantly be reviewing their policies,
that's
their
the difference,
practices,
isn't it,
their
between
growth
business
forecasts, their profitability,
Yes.
their deployment of their human capital, and saying, are we doing it right? Could we do it better? What are we doing that we shouldn't do? What are we not doing that we should do? And that, I think, is
Lacking?
in British
Isn't that
governments. I think
strange?
it's a rather self-serving
But not just British
oligarchy.
government, John, everywhere, if you think about it.
Sure.
This self-criticism.
Self-criticism is, I won't say a negligibly small phenomenon, but there isn't much evidence of it. I think governments are too often, if you like, in permanent campaign mode. They're
Yes.
permanently trying
Everywhere.
to proclaim their successes
That's all you have.
rather than to acknowledge the shortcomings. And that, I think, contributes to a disconnect with the electorate, because the electorate can see all sorts of problems that haven't been tackled or have been tackled very badly. And so it would be much better, to be honest, if we promised less and delivered better, whereas in fact we tend to promise more and deliver worse.
Yeah, so if we look at the business models and we look at, clearly the Jack Welch era is gone. The expectation is that it'll be purpose-driven leadership, leadership that believes that sustainable profits, need to be made. And leadership is just transparent. Again, we're coming back to transparency. Now, whilst there have been mega deals in 2020 of $2 trillion in terms of mergers and acquisitions, there is still a strong arm leadership. Now, if I can just take the Elon, Musk example of Twitter, and the way he's handled, he could have handled it differently. The way he handled his layoffs and the way he handled the whole situation is a very strong arm. So again, we're seeing political leadership, which is using strong arm tactics, which is the larger than life, and on the business side as well. Yeah. But then there is another side on the business side, which is a bit more Japanese in culture, which is called, which is basically nemawashi. And what nemawashi really means is that there's honest dialogue within the corporation, within the employees and the leadership in the corporate sector, and that it's consultative, it's participatory, it's consensus building. It might be slow. You see, that's the problem. I've been, trained American Citibank style, so everything has to be, speed is really important. Speed, productivity, time is money is time, whatever. But there is value in going slow. There is value in consensus building. How do you feel about that?
I think there are certain cultural traditions which inform or even dictate the approach that is followed. The consensus-orientated Japanese tradition is different to that of the UK. So I don't think it is easy simply to pluck from another culture and to plant in one's own territory. The Japanese are, if you like, almost psychologically or temperamentally oriented towards consensus. And I'm not sure you would find it easy to apply such an arrangement in, say, the United Kingdom.
But there is value in it, though.
But there is value in it, and even if it isn't as deliberative as in Japan, I think we can agree one important principle, and that is that on the whole, a contented workforce is a more efficient and effective workforce. So
the same goes for Parliament, a contented workforce in terms of parliamentary MPs.
Yes,
keep them happy, but to keep MPs happy is a tough one, isn't it?
It's a tough one, yeah, but if you simply try to browbeat people
yes.
into doing things that they don't want to do,
it doesn't work.
Well, then you're sowing seeds of discord. So I think on the whole, you've got to try in leadership, be it in the political sphere or commercial sphere, to carry people with you. And that's partly about having a strategic vision, it's partly about being an effective communicator, and it's partly about teamwork, not as a one-off, but as an ongoing process.
Absolutely. I'm going to come to your favorite subject, Churchill versus de Gaulle.
Well, I suppose I'm a partisan of
KBO.
Churchill. Yeah, de Gaulle was a great leader of France, without a doubt, but I suppose
and the reason I mention it, John, is because we're in wartime, in the sense that was wartime leadership. This is kind of wartime leadership too, with Zelensky and Ukraine, etc. And are we seeing, images repeat kind of? I mean, of course, you don't have the Churchills and the de Gaulles. I mean, you can't get them. But there are people who are trying to, be larger.
Yes, tyrants are not confined to one era.
Yes. And nor are heroes.
Phenomenon of tyrants is an historic phenomenon, a current phenomenon, and I fear it will be a future phenomenon. Equally, as you say, heroes or heroines can be found in every era. I would say that Churchill is not to be lauded, magnified and celebrated for all of his career, or particularly as a peacetime politician. Of course, he had great gifts of oratory and charisma and so on and so forth.
We discussed that. That is very critical for leadership, to be able to communicate.
Was he a great leader in peacetime? Not particularly, no, not really. But I think his reputation is overwhelmingly based on the fact that he got the key decisions right and was the right person to mobilise and motivate the UK when her very survival was at stake. And that was a question of decision making and taking the right courses of action, but it was also a question of being able to inspire. And that wasn't a gift that he was taught, that is a gift
that you learn on the job?
Possessed. Well, I think he had a
Do we inspire as leaders? Do we inspire?
Talent. Some do and some don't. I think Churchill just had the innate ability to find the right words and the correct tone of voice. And I mean, of course, he was mortified, literally desolate, when he lost the 1945 election after the Second World War, because I think he thought that a grateful nation would re-elect the Conservatives and he would remain Prime Minister. He was utterly shaken and distraught that didn't happen. But I think people felt he was the right leader for wartime, but they wanted a new peace. But in wartime, was he the right leader? I mean, he was magnificent. He was utterly fearless.
And so was de Gaulle.
He was incredibly eloquent. And Charles de Gaulle, of course, was an amazing leader.
I want to share with you something that I was reading in Kissinger's latest book. It's an amazing book. It's on leadership. It just came out last week. It's on Audible as well. He talks about different leadership strategies. The strategy of humility, as far as Germany was concerned, when Germany was coming out of the Second World War. Charles de Gaulle, he calls the strategy of will, interestingly, and Nixon, he calls the strategy of equilibrium, and Sadat, interestingly, it's strategy of transcendence. He, in Singapore, the leadership of the strategy of excellence, and Thatcher, the strategy of conviction. What do you have to say to Kissinger's analogy?
I don't think there's anybody on the planet with a greater capacity to survey the scene of global leadership.
Because he's been there. He's 99. It's just like he's still writing. Isn't that amazing?
It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary, and he's witnessed a lot. But I wouldn't dissent from that view. The notion of Sadat and transcendence does speak to an important truth. I mean, there was somebody who wanted to reach beyond his own tribe, if you will, and to try to forge accommodations. And I think that there are other examples of that. I mean, you could take in South Africa de Klerk and Mandela, both in a sense sought to cross the aisle without in any way abandoning his or her convictions and to forge a way forward for the people. And that involved some element of compromise and, above all, a willingness to talk to and hear from each other.
Yes.
People who were polar opposites,
listening,
who
again,
were
we're coming
historic
back to
enemies,
listening.
came to the point at which they said, we're human beings. Let's sit down at a table or wherever and talk to each other and hear from each other. And there are so many examples of that. It was what spawned peace in Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom. People who were sworn enemies, almost literally dedicated to seeing each other killed, sitting down at a table and eventually forming an executive in Northern Ireland that comprised them both.
True.
And that is a form of leadership. Now some people would say, oh, that's a sellout, that means abandoning your convictions. It needn't mean abandoning your convictions. It can mean accepting that your very strongly held convictions are matched by somebody else's very strongly held convictions, and that you can either focus on exterminating each other, or you can think, come on, let's find a way of peacefully coexisting. And democratic polity, that's surely preferable.
Yeah, when I'm going back to De Gaulle, I think what strikes me is that this creation of the larger than life, la France, like
Yes.
the patrie and the destiny of the world is
idea
at
of
stake.
France.
Yeah, the certain idea and the certain glorification, without which leadership cannot create that illusion. So is illusion building, illusionist leadership. We've seen plenty of that, and does it inspire illusionist? When you create the grandeur and then you chase that grandeur. I mean, when you think of Louis XIV, why did he build Versailles? What? Simply because you wanted La France to always be anchored from grandeur, and it has worked, hasn't it? The Treaty of Versailles was signed there. Even the current negotiations and the current conferences that happen in Macron's France right now, it is Versailles' grandeur. So, grandeur and past glorification. Erdogan, Turkey, everything is coming back to that.
I'm not sure I like the idea of illusion.
Well,
I'm not sure I like the idea of illusion. I like the idea of vision.
Yes.
And that vision might
And
be
strategy.
bold, it might be ambitious, and it might involve a
So
strategy.
illusion is dangerous.
Well, I think illusion is dangerous if you're trying to hide from the truth and to swallow or encourage other people to imbibe something that isn't deliverable. And that's what I see in the word illusion. The idea of an ambitious vision, something greater than the present, something quite idealistic or values-based and philosophical, and way beyond what exists now, is of itself potentially quite attractive, but it has to have accompanying it a route map to deliver it. In other words, there have to be staging posts and ways that you're going to get there. It can't just be abstract words.
Okay. So now coming to the final question, do we have the capability to call out bad leadership?
Yes, I think there is the capability to point out bad leadership. I suppose the difference here
Bad
is...
and good.
Well, I suppose the divide really is between democracies in which it can happen and dictatorships in which it is much more difficult for it to happen. In democracies, it may take time, but there is the democratic safety valve of public opinion ultimately holding sway, ultimately asserting itself, ultimately insisting on, let's say, a change of government or a change of leader. In a dictatorship, particularly with electronic communication and the internet and social media and so on, it can happen, but it can be much slower. So if you take a place like Burma, Myanmar, it can be much slower for the democratic process to assert itself, and sadly it's not all one way. In other words, it's not just a question of going from dictatorship to democracy. It can be the case, and that's what's happened in Burma, of dictatorship to democracy, back to dictatorship again. And who is, if you like, the embodiment of the carnage in that country? Well, Aung San Suu Kyi. Aung San Suu Kyi was the opposition leader. She eventually got into government. Many people would say she didn't do anything like enough in government, and she was too soft on the oppressors, and she damaged her brand in the process. But she's fundamentally a Democrat, and she ends up getting locked up. And we've now had what effectively is a coup.
Yes.
And after the progress of the last 10 years, Burma is now back in the dark ages.
So leadership takes you back and forth and back and forth. That's a good leadership.
Well, it's a way of saying, I suppose, Marvi, I suppose it's a way of saying there are no final victories.
True.
You know, it's a bit like improvement.
Yes.
Improvement,
Process
whether it be of an individual or of an organisation or a country. Improvement isn't a fact, it's a process. It has to be worked at and persisted with over and over and over again.
Final words for them on leadership. What kind of, I mean, when I think of leadership, empathy, listening, consultative, inclusive, these are the words that come to my mind for multilateralism to thrive, for us to be truly, one in terms of humanity. Not that humanity, that might be a very idealistic kind of a vision for leadership, but what would you currently say in the challenges that we have today in 2022, what kind of leadership do we need and deserve?
Honourable, purposeful, and bold.
And decisive?
Yes, I suppose, link bold and decisive. But it's got to be honourable, that's to say it has to be honest and values driven. It has to be purposeful in the sense of there being a clear idea and route map to its fulfilment. And it has to be bold, ambitious, decisive. In other words, it shouldn't be too meek, too cautious, too limited.
Thank you so much. So with that, we conclude today's Parliamentary Ponderings. Thanks a lot, John.
Marvi, thank you very much indeed.
Bye-bye.
Until the next time, onwards and upwards.
Thank you. Bye-bye.